Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this book launch of Future Practices of Citizenship in Asia and the West, the third volume in the trilogy entitled Care of the Self. This is a hybrid event, so I'm going to try to stand right here because I understand that this is the place where I'm not blurred as I speak. Okay. So,
see yourself.
Yes. So my name is Paul Rabé. I'm one of the three editors, along with Greg Bracken and Nurul Aslan, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. So it's a great pleasure to introduce this book. And some of the contributors are also with us, hybrid, online, and also in person. So we're very happy with that. I'm just going to speak very briefly about the book series and very briefly about the trilogy, and then I'm going to hand over to Gregory Bracken, who's going to talk in more detail about the series and also introduce the various interventions today. So this trilogy, I will say, I think is a very relevant one. It's on citizenship. It's the overall theme that connects the three books that were published in this book series, the Asian Cities book series. If we look around ourselves today, we see that citizenship is a very relevant theme, and it's been discussed in a sort of past, current, and future perspective in this trilogy. And today's volume that we'll be discussing looks at the future, comparing Asia and the West. So citizenship is very much in the news every day. We just had our elections here in the Netherlands yesterday, where you could argue that citizenship is still front and center. So it's by no means a unidirectional or uncontroversial topic. There's a lot to say about it. And the chapters in these books really do, I think, a splendid job of looking at this concept across regions, Asia and the West, mostly. Just one word about the book series, Asian Cities. I think this book is number 20 in our series. I will say with some regret that unfortunately the Asian Cities book series is coming to an end as we know it. We have it was published together with Amsterdam University Press, but we have now been bought by Routledge. So it will become a more commercially oriented series. Having said that, the series itself, so we're in transition. So the 4 or 5 series that we had with Amsterdam University Press are going to appear in a different form with Routledge or a different publisher in the future. That's all I can say now. But I will say I'm very happy that we were able to publish this trilogy because of the theme, but also because of the variety of contributors, the diversity that we have. So I think that's all I'm going to say. Gregory, if you can introduce in more detail the theme, the works, and who we're going to be hearing from today, that would be great.
Cool. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to Shalan and Mary Lynn and everybody at IIAS for organizing this and for supporting this whole project, because without them it wouldn't have been possible. I was very lucky because I was a research fellow at IIAS for years, and I know Paul from that, and we've collaborated on quite a few things, very happily, always. And then Nurul was my first PhD candidate to finish. So she is now teaching in the University of Manchester, and sadly, she only found out that she had to teach today, so she wasn't able to join us at all, but we couldn't have done it without her. This, as Paul said, is a trilogy. It looks at citizenship through the lens of Michel Foucault's concept of the care of the self, which is about looking after yourself and others in society, because if you don't do that, the sort of rights we all make use of as individuals will be damaged if society that supports those rights disappears. And as you said, the importance of this with the elections yesterday and the debate in this country and others, especially in Europe, about citizenship, who has the right to belong. I can't vote. I'm an EU citizen, so I can move here, live here, and I love that. If I wanted to become Dutch, I could, but I prefer having my own passport, coming from Ireland. But it's lovely having these intra-national bodies that you can come, and which the British rejected, sadly, 10 years ago. And so we've lost a lot of colleagues because they need visas or whatever, and that's very sad. Interestingly, and I'll come back to this at the epilogue, on entertaining ourselves to death, the person who may be our next prime minister is a very young, telegenic, photogenic man, and he's kind of the voice of cheerful optimism against the kind of xenophobia that we had with the previous head of the largest party, Geert Wilders. And also, because of the entertainment aspect, he was in a quiz recently. I don't know if you watched The Slimste Mens, The Cleverest Person. He did really well. So he would have actually parlayed this into visibility, which of course can be a double-edged sword, because that's what Boris Johnson did 10, 15 years ago by being on Have I Got News For You. Visibility got him the mayorship of London, and there was the Olympics, so then he became prime minister, and we saw what an incompetent, amoral idiot he was. I think we'd be in safer hands with Rob Yetted, but we will see how that plays out. But this began because after I finished as a fellow, I still continued working. Paul and I run PhD symposia in Delft and so on, but we organized an event on citizenship and the care of the self, comparing and contrasting ways of being a citizen in Asia and the West, because I read a statistic recently, which is 3 out of 4 people on the planet live under authoritarian regimes. And of course, we who live in democratic regimes, those are under attack, not only by bad actors trying to undermine them, but from within because of misinformation, something that we also address in the epilogue. But when we had such a lot of people wanting to be part of this, we split it in 2. And so the first one is called Ancient and Modern Practices, and the next one then was Contemporary. The division is less temporal and more theoretical, because the first papers really dealt with theory, and the second really dealt with practical things like care of the elderly in Japan, or Chinese diaspora across the world, the mental health of South Asian Americans, really interesting papers, Hindu ritual practices that are being infringed on by the growth of cities. And the first one was really very theoretical, looking at Japanese concepts of space or ancient Greek concepts. It began with me looking at Cicero's active citizenship, going back to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and the Epicureans who are non-active, and then comparing that with Confucianism, which is all about active citizenship. And because we had these 2, which were ancient and contemporary, it seemed like a logical step to do a future practices. And we'd also worked on a book before on future challenges for cities in Asia. So we had a new call, and we got nearly 100 participants. We narrowed that down to 20, who all turned up. And then out of that, we narrowed that down to 12. And uniquely in my experience, all 12 of them passed peer review. So we've got quite a thick volume for this one, which is lovely. And then the original intro is chapter 1 of the first book, and the epilogue is the last thing in the trilogy. But these were originally just extended interviews, and the peer reviewers in each case said, why don't you make it a separate chapter? So the beginning of the thing and the end of the thing, a book ended by these interrogations of citizenship, either in the ancient world and what's happening in the West to our notions of citizenship today. So today we had divided the book into 3 parts, and it fell very neatly into the 3 parts. So we've got part 1 on citizens' rights, part 2, which was COVID and its responses, and part 3 were the future challenges. So today we'll have Binti and Trinh on ethical citizenship in the configuration of market socialism, and how women working in the NGO sector in post-reform Vietnam are being put under pressure because of these kind of paternalistic ideas. And also John Chu looking at practicing citizenship in urban China. This is for migrant activism in Hangzhou. COVID, we've seen a lot of, again, bad actors using it as an excuse to clamp down on freedom of expression, artistic expression, and so on. So Don't Say That by Julie Trébeau and Manojna Yaluri looks at artistic freedom and how it's been attacked. And we've also then another chapter from this section, which is Seohee Kwak, which compares the COVID-19 restrictive measurements and how they went down with the public in South Korea and the Netherlands, because there were also riots here, attacking ambulances and all kinds of things. And then 2 chapters rather neatly. Again, this has been the way this book has worked out very helpfully for us, 2 from each. Future Challenges looks at Cambodia's new ecological citizenships, which is Stéphanie, looking at environment activism in the kingdom today. Really interesting paper. And then Establishing Green Habits, the role of NGOs in depoliticizing environmental governance in urban China, which is Virginie Arantes. And then we'll just briefly end with a note on the epilogue. So On that, we can invite our first speaker if they're there, hopefully, and they can talk about Chapter 2, Ethical Citizenship and the Configuration of Market Socialism in Vietnam.
Okay.
Okay, well then we can go to the second one, which is John Chu. If John Chu is there.
Did you send the link to them? Do that.
Oh, did you not have the link?
No.
Oh. Well, we can work backwards for the people here. Can you quickly send the link to them?
Yeah, I will, but then I need to take my own laptop because I send only for the sign-ups.
So, Stephanie, are you ready to go?
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Wonderful.
Okay, there's also.
But I can stay in the blur or should I be more?
Right here.
Okay.
Francis Bazaar.
We don't want to see you in blur.
Yes.
Off.
Why not?
So, Stephanie, thank you very much.
So here I am, okay.
Do you want to change to the slides?
Oh, I don't think, I didn't send any pictures.
Yeah, no, we have
so-
slides, please, if you scroll
Oh.
through and you can get to Stephanie's.
Okay.
Went to trouble to update this. It's quite near the end, obviously. Yes, back
Oh,
one,
before,
back two. Yeah,
that this
Yeah.
one.
back one. And see, so here
Yes.
is, maybe you'd like to introduce yourself briefly and then the doctor.
Well, so I'm still doing research in Cambodia, so actually I had an issue here in the IIAS newsletter about the Korean Republic and the Republic of South Vietnam, but okay. And I'm doing also research with the Center for Khmer Studies in Phnom Penh. And my chapter was about an environmental activist group, which is Mother Nature Cambodia. So just before, the event, I thought, okay, what happens with them? And has the situation changed? And in fact, not so much. So this group was founded in 2013 and was super active, and we had very successful campaigns. But that, of course, did not go so well with the Cambodian government. And therefore, they have been harassed and repressed. And now the key members are in prison and they face a sentence of 6 to 8 years, which is a very serious sentence. They have been accused of plotting against the government, so their situation is pretty bad. So that's the situation, but what happens with the rest of the group? Are there still people there? Yes, so the campaigns continue. They are now working on Thai and Vietnamese vessels coming to fish in Cambodian waters. They are still working on the Bracken Wildlife Sanctuary. They are still doing a lot of videos. And that's interesting because one of the features of this group was these super punchy videos in which every activist appeared in person, demonstrating all kinds of things. And I was wondering if in this context of repression, things have changed. Yes and no. So you still have someone who appears, but I noticed that it's the same young lady in every video, which I think is a sign of something very unstable for Mother Nature Cambodia. So my idea, by looking at Mother Nature Cambodia, was to examine the connection between environmental activism and political culture, and the possibility that that type of activism can produce some new types or new practices or new processes of citizenship. And I was very interested also in the visuality of this citizenship, because of course, Mother Nature Cambodia has been discussed by already many people from very different perspectives, but their visual work has not been so much discussed. And I was wondering how it can, how a prism through the prism of visual culture, for instance, could shed a different light on what they are doing, and especially on the kind of citizenship that they propose. And that's why my chapter focused more specifically on the videos they have done. So I chose a few series. There was one on sand mining. There was one on the Kokong Island. So all kinds of subject of deforestation, and also all these tycoons in Cambodia who are land grabbing, etc. So I try to understand in what ways these videos could be seen as some kind of citizenry visual act. What was the connection with materiality? What was the performance? If it was a form of performative citizenship. And I contrasted that also with the attitude of the government, because we cannot say that the current government is not interested in ecological issues, and we cannot say that they are just repressing activists. They have also their own concerns. They have also their own way of mitigating some of the worst situations in Cambodia, because Cambodia is a very fragile country from the environmental point of view. So how can we examine this environmentality of the Cambodian government? In what way do they create environmental subjects? And when I say that, I mean subject as both, subject Cambodian people, but also subject as matters of concern. And so it's always interesting when you look again at your chapter a few years later, because the situation has changed in Cambodia. I mean, we don't have Hun Sen anymore as a prime minister, we have his son. And that also, brings this issue of what is this kind of hereditary politics, where the son inherits, the function of the father. So what does it mean in terms of building? What is, how is dynasty built, and what does it imply in terms of environment? Because there are constructions everywhere. I mean, building in the literal and metaphorical sense, obviously. And so did, the ecological policy of the government change since Hun Manet has come to power 2 years something ago? So I think it's a bit early to to have a clear view of that, because what I see is that Hun Sen opened a sequence which we could call the Techo era, and Techo comes from his honorific title. And I think it's a very interesting era, because Hun Sen has been promoting something that he calls the win-win policy, which was initially a way of ending the civil war by integrating the last Khmer Rouge without bloodshed, giving them some kind of advantages in terms of jobs and properties, etc., but while preserving the interest of the Cambodian population. And this win-win, in the meantime, has become a kind of gigantic philosophy, which applies to everything, and which has become synonymous with stability, prosperity, development. And I think the question of development is also something very interesting to examine in this context, because, for instance, Mother Nature Cambodia, they say it themselves, there is a tension between the protection of natural resources as they do it, and the conception of development as a government can have it, and maybe as other people, and not only in Cambodia, may have. So how do they solve that tension, and how this kind of citizenship they try to create is actually born within this tension as an alternative answer, instead of just opposing the two things. So my chapter also looked at this environmentality and from a kind of visual viewpoint, because I was interested in the spectacle of ecological concern of the Cambodian government. So the way suddenly they crack down on some traffic somewhere to show that they are super proactive, or how they create also a facade of environmental concern. But again, I do not want to just say that it's a kind of theatrical piece for, for sake or the sake of international relations, or because I think it's an articulation that is more complex than that. But I thought that it was in the chapter, it was interesting to see how you could talk about visuality and counter-visuality, and the kind of different archives that can be generated through the visual. The visual they produce, I mean, whether it is photos or videos, etc. And I think there is a huge work to be done still. I mean, if we talk about the future of practices and research. I think we have here an enormous archive of videos and photos that will maybe give us a very different perspective on what's happening. So that was, in short, my chapter. And what I wanted to add, because of course Mother Nature Cambodia is a very radical form of activism. You have different types of activism, of environmental activism in Cambodia, obviously. But this one is really, I mean, the way they have occupied the space is, I think, still a very fascinating thing. And I think there is a matter of survival, because if you are extremely visual, then, you know, I mean, media, international media will be interested and other activists will be interested. So, I mean, in a way, it will maybe be more difficult to kill people in prison, or so that's also one thing. But at the same time, to what extent has it obscured maybe the presence of other activists who do not benefit from the same networks? That's also maybe a question that should be raised. And in fact, the other questions is now, as we all know, we are in a period of defunding, especially in the United States. And I think that the disappearance of US aid is a strong blow to Cambodian activism in general, not only in terms of environment. So what will happen in the next years is also something that that needs to be monitored. And I was also very interested because I was in Cambodia this summer, and I was just in the weeks after the 5-day war between Thailand and Cambodia on the border. There was an atmosphere of nationalism, and not simply top down, but also bottom up. So people were pretty much, against the Thai and showing all kinds of videos, which was interesting because social media were really buzzing with all kinds of things. So what will be the impact also of that in terms of activism, I wonder. And I think it's an important question. And it's also maybe about the idea of not separating the different forms of activism. So human rights and environment should be brought together again, and to see if something, because youth is a very important factor. I think that if Mother Nature Cambodia had such a success, it was because it was a lot of young people, and they have understood in a way that they have some power. It's maybe not yet a strong political power, but it's the power maybe to create a public debate. So it will be very interesting to see how much this understanding of power, or what this understanding of power will produce at the moment that nationalism is on the rise, and that funding for all the people who try to be on the progressive side is diminishing. That's it.
Thank you very much. If you want to quickly take a question or two, if there are any, we could do that after each. We can have a plenary afterwards anyway, but just in case anybody had anything urgent. No? Very good. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Lovely.
Yeah, the third chapter.
Very good. Can you,
Yeah,
that's been?
Yeah.
Super.
I'll ask her, can she,
Yeah, and can you go to the
but no, she's
not here. So who do we have?
third.
Chanchu?
Yeah, she's here.
Lovely. Is Chanchu able to come?
Okay, so I should instead do the next
Are we able to get
presentation? Yes?
Yes, please.
Okay,
Can you turn on?
good. Yeah, I'm trying to turn on my video so you can see me. Yes, hi. So, greeting from Berlin. I'm so glad to have the chance being here. Finally, this book is out, and yes, and I would like to just briefly introduce my chapter here. I will say take you on a journey through these interconnected dimensions of citizenship practices among migrant workers in urban China during their struggles to redefine themselves against the names and identities imposed from above. This was a part of my dissertation thesis, which I finished like 3 years ago. So yes, and the fieldwork based under my fieldwork was 2013 till 2016. So yeah, it was nearly 10 years ago. So looking back, it's really now the situation is also totally different. Yes, but that's also the meaning of looking back, recalling these all resistance and struggles which perhaps have been forgotten. Yes, so I will just give 3 small scenes like from my whole article, just give you some quick impressions, like how this grassroots identity and collective resistance look like, and how this ambivalent politics of volunteerism, and the last is the challenges and lessons of this digital memory and disappearance. So I didn't prepare my own slides. I will just tell you. So I will control my speed to just try to let you all understand it. So this whole processes of this being grassroots for these migrant workers in urban China was fundamentally about this representation. So I called it in my article as politics of representation. So these migrant activists in my field, they really understood that the power to name is the power to position. They weren't waiting for others to present them, they represented themselves. So they claimed their right to define their place in the city, except especially in this, it was the last decade. So during the 20 years ago, like 2005, 2006, that was the time that we really didn't have this power to name themselves. Yes, so what they do, they build their own website, they debate about this grassroots spirit and publish their own magazines to transform this narrative from marginalization into the self-improvement and mutual support. So in Stuart Hall's terms, we can say they challenge this dominant regime of representation by creating their counter positions of alternative positive imaginary. And this struggle for repositioning did not stop at grassroots. As their organization, their NGO, institutionalized some way, another challenge then emerged. The dominant discourse put migrant workers nearly only at the receiving end of help, so never as helpers. So volunteerism in China at that time, as officially promoted, meant middle-class citizens assisting disadvantaged groups like migrants. They cast only as passive recipients. So these activists saw this flaw and then they said, we want to coin our own category, so worker volunteer. So the concept was simple and based on their existing grassroots network. Migrants from their own networks of self-help and mutual aid, and rejecting the narrative that they were only objects of pity. But still, these efforts to reframe volunteer like resistance, not only from society, but even from their own fellow migrants, because they struggle to see this neighborly help as how they can fit under this banner of voluntary. So the struggle over names and the definitions was both empowering and ambivalent. It's not simply activism versus governance or regime. It's really the blurring of boundaries, the entanglement of resistance and subjection. So I just emphasize here in the article this how ambiguity of inclusion between collective and individual. This shift in discourse from grassroots to worker volunteer represented a deeper political and organizational transformation as the whole context, like from these rural migrants go to the city, and really it's a big transformation during 20 or even 30 years. So while this original aim was to change their marginal social position as migrants, as a group, social group, the new goal, the new aim became supporting individual aspirations and personal growth. So we can say the politics of collective mobilization faded and are replaced by a logic of integration and actually more like active citizenship that was less resistant and more accommodating. So this whole and also the third frame for my article is more about a methodological thought of remembering this struggle as encountering practice of citizenship. Because when I tried to trace the whole story systematically, I discovered that much of it had vanished. The homepage was deleted in 2016, and blog posts also disappeared. Even their official Chinese wiki page was gone. So I had to use this Internet Archives Wayback Machine to recover all fragments I could find. So this disappearance, it's self-political. And as William Waters also said, remind us, genealogy is really the retrieval of forgotten struggles and subjugated knowledge. So what does it mean for citizenship when such history disappears? To recover and retell these struggles is itself an act of citizenship. It's a refusal to be reframed or erased by dominant regime. So I think we have to say or to remember that citizenship is not just practices in protests or legal claims. It's also practices in the everyday act and naming of storytelling, of archiving. So it's practiced when we as researchers also dig through this Wayback Machine to recover voices that were meant to be forgotten. Yeah, so that's nearly all I want to say. So in the end, as I said, as a final part, as we discuss citizenship in context beyond the West, also in authoritarian and neoliberal context, so I think it's important to remember this multidimensionality. So that was about the pain and pride of this grassroots identity. It was about this ambivalence of volunteerism and this fluidity and the volatility of digital memory. I think it's still very relevant also in this digital citizenship today, which is becoming more perhaps essential for our society. But these are not separate issues. They are interconnected aspects of the ongoing negotiation of citizenship from below. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lovely, thank you. We'll go now to Seohee, Kwak, who I think is online.
Yes.
Yes, lovely.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm so sorry for not being able to attend in person. Okay. Yeah, I'm the one who wrote the chapter 7 about the comparative analysis of the Netherlands and Vietnam. Well, if I may say, it is a pleasure for all of us to say the COVID-19 is a thing of the past, right? We moved through this dark era. Well, a few years ago, I conducted a qualitative comparative analysis of to what extent the concept of citizenship has been manifested similarly and or differently in two countries. I chose two countries because, well, obviously, very different cases in terms of the degree of democracy. They have a different political regime, they have different institutions and systems and society. Do we have the PPT slide that I prepared and sent an email to you?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Well, let me start with one small, I'll say, commonality. Well, in both countries, we had protest. Even though in a single party regime, which is Vietnam, people resisted the COVID policies of the government. Well, when it comes to the COVID-19 policies, we can say curfew, mask mandate, what else? Well, lockdown, etc. So in both country cases, the citizens, many citizens have been sort of the resistant to or against the government policies in terms of the COVID-19 measures. So these are the pictures that I prepared as a similarity. And then can we move on to the next one? Yes. Well, this is more like a conceptual metrics. It is not like a quantitative or the statistical data that I found. Well, I made the conceptual metrics in terms of the two different aspects. The first one was the manifestation of citizenship. To what extent and in what way the concept of citizenship has been manifested and realized in the countries. And let me start with the Dutch case first. Well, as most of you might be familiar with what happened in the Netherlands, well, during the COVID-19, a lot of people, they took to the streets or the squares to resist, oppose the government's mask mandate, curfew, etc. But in terms of their citizenship, when we think about the two different dimensions of citizenship, which is the right and the responsibilities, both of the aspects were fully and clearly institutionalized in the Dutch political institutions, relevant laws, regulations for assembly, etc. And also in terms of the contentious political action, well, I'll say for Dutch citizens, they have pretty ample options. They could have criticized the government on Facebook. They have been criticized verbally in them square or the Museum Plain. So in terms of the forms of political actions to oppose against the government in terms of the COVID-19 policy, they have many options, and then they were able to express and ultimately exercise the right as citizens. And when we think about the threshold of state control, I will say it was pretty high. Because for the threshold or the tipping point of the state control, when, to what extent state is responsive or tolerant to the contentious political action of citizens, they were pretty tolerant as long as citizens, protesters, whatever you name them, as long as they do not lead to the really aggressive and violent acts. For example, causing injuries of other individuals or damage of other properties. So of course, the security forces were dispatched in the public spaces, and then they were looking, keeping an eye on them, and then they took a sort of a authoritative action, like arresting, cordoning off, or asking them, the protesters, to disperse. They took a certain action of authority only when there's a sign or actual act of physical aggression. For example, throwing a stone to the police officers on the street, or, well, in a really extreme way, setting on a fire on a police vehicle. Then comparatively in Vietnam, I would say the manifestation of citizenship was quite limited. Let me explain. Well, of course, nominally on the surface, under the constitution, penal code, etc., the Vietnamese institutions, they guarantee the exercise of the rights of the citizenship. However, I argue in the chapter that obligations, the responsibilities to conform to or to comply with the state, what the state or the government is doing, outweighed it much more than their right. So when it comes to the tipping point of the state control, I would say relatively it was much lower than the Dutch case. For example, a lot of Vietnamese citizens who were not satisfied with what the government was doing for control of the COVID-19, well, mainly they move on to the cyberspace rather than just taking to the street in offline in public spaces. For example, they posted some critical comment on their individual blogs or Facebook page, etc. But what happened to them, those who criticized the government, well, specifically the government's COVID-19 policies, many of them got arrested or at least taken to the detention center for interrogation under the charge or in the name of preventing and protecting public order. And then they were said, they were told by the security officers that you are violating the state's interests that are trying to control the COVID-19 virus. So under the name of public order and the state's interest, the individual and the collective right to exercise opposition or resistance has been seriously curtailed in Vietnamese institutions. That's what I try to identify in terms of the differences. So to conclude, I would say we can say in two cases, there are really notable differences in terms of how the citizenship, the concept of citizenship is really exercised in terms of the specific policies initiated by the government. And regarding the state control, the tolerance toward the popular contentious political action in fully democratic societies like the Netherlands, it is much higher and clear. As long as you do not lead to the violence, your rights are to some extent and largely guaranteed. But on the other hand, in single-party states or in a broader sense, authoritarian regimes, discretionary power or very unexpected interpretation of public order and the state interest could be used, manipulated to constrain individual rights as a citizens. Okay, that's it for today. And then if you have any question, you can raise questions later on in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lovely. Who have we got next?
We can react.
Lovely.
Can we react on?
Yes, if you wish, if you have a question you'd like to ask now, please.
Yeah, I'm Rabé Belmont, and I spend most of my time in Vietnam. And in fact, I was in Vietnam when the COVID outbreak was there. And then we got several invitations from the Dutch government to go on a plane and fly back to Europe. And I saw how they handle the COVID in Europe and how they handle it in Vietnam. And I decided to stay in Vietnam. So I was in Da Nang, and I think in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh, the situation was different because those are bigger cities and they have more city-like behavior. While in Da Nang, it was incredibly quiet, everything, there were no problems. We had one outbreak that there were 6 or 7 hospitals that was, but my impression was that in the Netherlands and in Europe and in the West, you had a lot of information that was very, that didn't have any value, but resulted in a lot of stupid decisions. While in Vietnam, they were much more on the preventive way, and they were thinking, well, we had Ebola before, and to prevent is better than. And what I saw was that on a certain moment, I was driving on my bike, and suddenly I saw everybody with a mask. And then 1 hour later, I heard there was an outbreak. And how they handled it, you cannot do that in Europe because they will not accept it. But in Vietnam, they can do it, and it worked very well. They published where the people have been who had COVID, where exactly they have been in this place, in this place, in that place, and everybody who was there in that place, they also had to go to test themselves on COVID. But it was, when we go to the supermarket, everybody stands 3 meters behind, everybody get a temperature check. So it was a complete different situation. I never felt that it was the government, it was much more the people themselves, especially because I don't look young. They see me, regard me as an older person, and they very often reacted like, I don't care about it, but we have to do this for our parents and for the older people. And that's something I was missing in the West. And it's more I think it's more the people themselves that are more concerned for all the people as they were in like in the Netherlands.
Yeah. Do you want to respond to that? Would you agree?
Well, just a quick one. Well, I totally agree in terms of the different, I would say, behaviors of the citizens in the Netherlands and Vietnam. Well, for example, in the Vietnamese case, most of people, as you said, well, voluntarily or involuntarily, they were really good at, informally, they were very good at wearing a mask and then trying to keep the distance in the supermarkets, etc. But what I was trying to focus academically for this comparative analysis was a more contentious political action. Of course, a lot of people might could have thought, okay, to prevent the spread of the COVID-19, we need to follow the government rules. Well, a lot of people might have thought in that way, right? Just trying to comply with what the government is trying to come up with the new policies and measures. But I was trying to focus on more contentious dimension of political action, those who were trying to resist or oppose, or at least to raise their voices that they are not happy or in favor of what the government is doing. So my chapter could have been more comprehensive, as you said, like more voluntary and then law abiding or following the citizens. But I would say it was more like a limited section of the political behavior.
Yeah, I think it's a general problem, but that's for another discussion, that people consider Vietnam always as a dictatorship. And I always say, well, I've been in the DDR and I've been in a lot of communist countries in the past, but Vietnam has nothing of that. When I'm in Vietnam, I can find every information I want on internet, on YouTube, everything. When the official papers publish something and I think this is strange, I just go to an international and then I see the opposite thing. So that doesn't goes with a dictatorship, and it is the same for in the time of COVID. I was always looking what information do I find about it in other papers, not only what the government, but it's another discussion.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much for that contribution. But we still have 2 more speakers. So, Virginie, we'd like you to go next, if that's okay, please. And then we can go, we have slides.
That's the best place to be.
Yeah, that's so this bio notes, which you can introduce yourself if you like. Thank you for being here. And this is just a little from the abstract, so people have this as well.
Well, first of all, sorry for being late, but my first train was delayed and then it was like a spiral of delays and I left home at 8:20 from Brussels, but I'm here, so I'm happy. So yes, I'm a postdoctoral researcher in Brussels from the.
Sometime look at the.
Okay, so where should I look? Here.
Just there.
Oh, here. Okay.
It's frozen area.
It's frozen,
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
it's working.
Okay, perfect. So yes, I'm a postdoctoral researcher, mainly working on environmental governance and more recently on nationalism. I will come back to this at the end of my presentation, connecting to what you were saying. And my research mainly focuses on China, now Singapore and Taiwan also, more comparative studies. And so my chapter here was part of my fieldwork, which I developed for my PhD, which I finished in 2020. And so my fieldwork was based in Shanghai, and it went through from 2016 to 2018 mostly. And so at the time, I wanted to assess what the scholarship was naming an associational revolution in China with the rise of a lot of organizations, NGOs, but also non-registered organizations that were sprouting all around China, and a lot related to the environment. As the environmental issues in the 2010s were really becoming a pressing challenge in China for the citizens, because they were, of course, feeling the consequences of pollution, etc., but also for the government, because it was becoming a social, undermining social stability, sorry. So there was a lot of protests, and people were really against the government for the non-respect of the environmental issues. So there was really a legitimate action for public participation coming from Chinese citizens. But when I went to the field, what I discovered was completely different. So 2013, 2014, Xi Jinping came to power. And based on the literature I was reading before going to the field, and also to this connection between environmental movements and democratization practices, I was kind of expecting some kind of democratic openings for citizens to engage more in environmental affairs, for instance. Well, then I got to the field and I discovered how naive I was, because when Xi Jinping came to power, we saw very rapidly an authoritarian turn with anti-corruption campaigns, media control, new security measures, etc. And also two laws that came in 2016 to restrict to restrict the development and the registration and the way of acting of NGOs, environmental others, both domestic and international. So very rapidly, the international, it was very difficult to register in China. And for the domestic, it also became more harder to register only one NGO working in a field in one province. So a lot of restrictions for NGOs too, not receiving foreign funds, or if you receive, I mean, everything is very controlled. So in a way, it restricted their actions, but this is not specific to China. Egypt, Russia, they all did the same after the color revolution. So there was this agenda of restricting the development of this kind of NGOs. And so what I saw during my fieldwork was that the environmental organizations that stayed were slowly kind of co-opted by the state through procurement practices. So the state were paying the NGOs, which were doing work related to environmental education, waste management, which was a specific field I studied on the ground. And so we saw, what I saw was a professionalizing and managing the sector. And so there was a kind of, I don't call it collaboration, because I mean, there is a difference in power between this way of collaborating. I say cooperation because the state has more power to mandate what the NGOs will do because they have the funding. And so I started noticing that these NGOs were in the end legitimizing all which came after, which is the ecological civilization, which combines ecological concern with moral and patriotic cultivation. So what, yes, the book I published after, based on my PhD, is really thinking about this environmental consensus that was growing and how NGOs were actually feeding this consensus on the ground. Yes, so NGOs, that's why I developed in my chapter, became kind of mediators to cultivate a form of green citizenship. And by this I mean self-disciplined, responsible, aligned with national goals. So rather than empowering or more, for instance, regarding waste, why there is so much waste, why we are following this economic development system. Instead of focusing on this question, everything became more techno-managerial, and that's why I also speak about post-politicization in the chapter, which is how environmental concerns slowly become depoliticized from more I forgot the specific word, but I mean, yes, the depoliticization of environmental movements, and instead of, yes, as I was saying, why is waste generated, why we use so much plastic, etc. It was more on, we need to recycle, and this is not different from what happens here too. I mean, since I was born, I was taught to how I need to not waste water. So yes, I saw this kind of developing also in kindergartens, in schools, and that was also the NGOs, so developing this kind of works. So in the end, the NGOs kind of played a crucial role in sustaining this political consensus regarding environmental issues. And what they were doing, it was translate state objectives into everyday practices, for instance, with the waste management systems that became obligatory in Shanghai, for instance, and kind of shaping citizen subjectivities and reinforcing a form of governance that extends beyond the state. And so it's kind of a concept of, there is authoritarian environmentalism, which means you use authoritarian means to achieve environmental goals. And then there is environmental authoritarianism, where you use environment to reinforce the authoritarian system. And in this system, you have more control. So you use regulations, etc., to restrict the development capacities of NGOs, you use more judges, I mean, you use a lot of actors, and at the same time, you develop more means also on the ground, horizontally, with NGOs, for instance, but also with the communities on the ground, the Seohee. So you really develop an arm of the state at this micro level through the NGOs, which have also a paper of resolving this kind of fragmentation on the way politics are developed in China, where local governments have a certain level of agency. And so the NGOs also serve as watchdogs on the ground to see that the waste policies that were developed from the central level are actually developed on the ground. So this was when I saw the call for the conference, I was how citizenship is reframing. It helped me think for my own research of how, yes, the NGOs, where you think could help, or should, as you say, develop more agency from the citizenship, more in the end, kind of work in the other way, reinforcing the state. But the organizations, the leaders of the organization were very aware of this, and they said, well, we know that now we have to take advantage of this will of the state to resolve environmental issues. So we go, we really take the wave and develop our environmental agenda. But yes, on the other side, the narrative really gets restricted in this post-political framework I try to show in the chapter. Yeah, so yes, it's like really my aim was to show this intertwinement of participation and control and morality and politics, and also how it tries to change this paternalistic citizenship that has evolved in post-reform era China, where many people said, I will not do waste management. I mean, the government needs to do it. I don't care. They need to. So really, how NGOs could become allies of the state in this goal. Yeah, that was it.
Thank you very much. Super. Okay. Yeah. Are there any quick questions? No burning questions yet, but we will have a discussion. And now we have, I think, our last speaker today, which is Trinh. Okay. In Trinh, there? No? Muted.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear
Yeah.
me? Yes.
Yes. Very good. Lovely.
Yes. Yeah, it's nice to see you there. And then, yeah, I'm glad to present my book chapter again here in this book launch event. Yes. So my name is Bing. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the National Research and Innovation Agency at Bracken in Indonesia. Before that, I did my PhD at the University of Leeds between 2015 and 2020. So this is a part of my PhD research. And my chapter in this book is on ethical citizenship of women working in the NGO sector in Vietnam. So in this chapter, I discussed the new mode of government that the socialist state in Vietnam uses to both liberalize and restrain people's freedom in the market, particularly like my research focus on women. So as you know, Vietnam began economic reforms in the late 1980s under the slogan đổi mới, or in English is economic renovation. Since then, the Communist Party state continued this policy until now through intensified marketization and privatization. So with this policy, Vietnam moved from a closed economy to an open economy focusing on export-oriented industrialization to attract foreign capital, like mainly FDIs. So these contribute to a steady high-level economic growth in Vietnam. However, politically, Vietnam remains a socialist country, so the Communist Party continued to lead the social and political clusters.
So for marketization, it operates a strategy of government from a distance, so allow people to become more freedom in the market, but at the same time using morality to promote entrepreneurship, market mentality, and risk-taking behavior in line with the logic of the market. But morality is also a means for the state to discipline people within the traditional norms and obligations. So this mode of government aligns with Foucault's proposition about the technique of governmentality, involving technique of subjectivity and subjection through the conduct of conduct as a way of disciplining people based on norms considered as normal and correct. So under the rule of the socialist state, which is a very highly politically centralized regime, many studies report on Vietnam's neoliberal hybridity. It reflects the coexistence between proliferated neoliberal behavior and logic and mentality such as free choice, entrepreneurship, but also like at the same time, there are traditional and cultural norms are also promoted by the state, and which is binding people's freedom. So two of them are not necessarily aligned, but sometimes like even contradictory. So these norms disproportionately affect people based on their gender, age, ethnicity, and geographical background. So my research focus on women. Mainly, I examine narratives and life story of women working in the NGO sector in Vietnam in post-đổi mới economic transformation. And my research reveals that women's voluntary participation in philanthropy and social work demonstrating a form of responsible citizenship for their contribution to collective welfare. So this form of citizenship is appealing to professional, salary, middle-class women who are concerned about being moral and ethical through act of giving or sacrificing to care for the welfare of others, mainly the vulnerable groups. So my informants often express a desire to contribute to society. That's why they do not work in for-profit sectors such as businesses or the state. And even though they usually had a very high qualification and many graduated from abroad. So this finding aligns with Marquis or Boston's proposition that people seek a sense of belonging and usefulness mainly through their domestic talents and caregiving. Furthermore, like my informants also distinguished their humanitarian philanthropic acts from profitable opportunities in the business or in the government sectors where people only work for money. Meanwhile, they work to contribute to the social good. So my research found that women are especially attracted to the profession in the humanitarian, social work, nonprofit, NGO sector. This job allows them to claim a kind of social prestige by caring for the collective cause, believing that they are spiritual free, freer than people who are only rich in terms of money. And then for those people, which is the people, they are usually subject to social criticism, such as corrupt and greedy. So this is also demonstrated in women's consumption behavior as well. Informants discuss about their consumption for their family members, such as their children, education, and health. And then they have to sacrifice their own need, the consumption for their own needs. So the quality of goods often are symbolic of their love and their care, also means that they are more expensive. So in this respect, by portraying good citizens, women who volunteer to work for free, to care for other people, for the members in the family, for the vulnerable people, continue to produce a status quo by repeating the norms and sacrifice to care for their caregiving responsibilities. So despite like there are assumptions like market liberalization often give people, especially like women in this case, more choices to improve their welfare. Their responsibilities or their compliance with the traditional norms confine them to the lower economic sector or an inferior position by accepting sacrifice and inferiority. So the finding in this research contribute to debates on evolving forms of citizenship practices in the context of neoliberal restructuring in economies, in developing economies, or in non-Western or non-liberal contexts in Asia. So this is my book chapter about. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Okay, I guess we can go to our own little epilogue. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
No, can I?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, so this is the last one, and then we'll go to Paul and I will kind of make some summarizing points, but open the floor to questions, and we have the Q&A, and then we'll round it out. So this began as being part of the introduction, but it expanded, and peer reviewers suggested we make it a separate thing. So basically, citizens' rights are under threat because we're in a far more polarized and authoritarian world. That has emerged very clearly through the examinations primarily of Asia, and Vietnam really emerged quite importantly today, oddly, but increasingly in the West with this swing to the right and people like Donald Trump and so on. And people seem to like this because I was reading something and it said, God used to have all the answers and give you direction in life or baby names or whatever. And now the internet does that better than God ever did. So it's kind of a dangerous place we are. But because the internet is premised on profit, and it's the only thing, the way they can make the money is to keep us online for longer and then tailor their ads to us. And our behavior is being modified so that we stay online longer, watching things which aren't necessarily true, because there's the difference between the platform and the publisher, and these platforms aren't treated like publishers. They're not responsible for the truth of what they state, and they're not interested in it. Zuckerberg has actually said this. They are not arbiters of truth. They think lived experience kind of outweighs that. So it's increasingly important that we learn how to differentiate fact from fiction, to be able to understand what's happening and that everything you see online might not be true. The problem is that these algorithms are kind of these black box. So we treat them like the tides or the weather, and we can't do anything about it. But these were made by people, and they can be changed by people. And if we can get the social media companies to change their business model, then perhaps they could actually be a force for good. Because of course, in our little phones, and you can talk to them, you have access to the sum total of human knowledge, but there's an awful lot of untruth and disinformation there too. So it's almost like the brighter the light, sometimes the darker the shadows, and in the shadows, of course, this is where the trolls live, sadly. In this, we actually explore, how did this come about? How did we get to this point where it's kind of all about entertainment and amusing ourselves? And there's a very good book by a guy called Postman, who traces this back to kind of the second half of the 20th century in America. And of course, in America, where the internet developed, America has a very poor tradition in public service broadcasting, because it's all about profits. Whereas in communist countries, it was all about propaganda with some culture, but no ads. In Europe, it was a mixture of both. So BBC still doesn't have ads, and it's about entertainment and information. America, it was always about profit. So they had soap operas with ad breaks, and there was nothing to do with truth. And this, unfortunately, is the model that has informed the social media companies. And when they began, they realized that they were providing a service, and the more data they had, the better that service could be. But what this has done is it has decoupled this public aspect of social media because it's so individual, which means you'll be looking at the same thing as somebody else, but you'll be then taken down another rabbit hole where you'll be shown different ads. So this decoupling of the social from the individual means that this idea that social media is somehow social, or a kind of 21st century agora, is not true, because it's premised on such carefully curated individuality that it is actually doing damage, sadly. In the after the Second World War, television, particularly by the 1980s, had lowered discourse. It was all about the visuals, and that's why I mentioned Rob Yetta earlier. He looks good on TV, but he seems to have good messages that do resonate. And I think we're probably less prone to that here, but in America it's gone quite far. But this turned these public debates into entertainment. It wasn't about meaningful discussion of these important issues. It was about, could you get off the best one-liner? If you see a presidential debate, all they want to talk about the next day is who got the best one-liner, like some kind of comedy program. And people like Rabé have done well because they are clever enough to get themselves on programs and do well. So it's so you can use these to your advantage, but it's the premise of it is quite bad. And this stems from the 19th century with context-free information. The Telegraph introduced the idea of information as a thing in itself that was just interesting and stimulating, but it was completely context-free. And you see that when you watch the news, you watch misery here and misery there, and then they'll show you a cat playing the piano. And by the time it's over, you've forgotten what the beginning thing was. And you might have been horrified, but it doesn't matter, because it's kind of, okay, you're up to date. What have you really learned? Not very much, because what are you going to do about it? Again, probably nothing. So the internet's business model is profit over public service. Sadly, it also lacks effective regulatory oversight. And AI, we also mentioned, this was prompted by the peer reviewers. AI is a useful tool if used correctly and ethically, and it can do an awful lot of good. But people who rely on it in the wrong way, they can fall into a trap. And there's also people who'll be replaced by AI, not people like teachers or nurses or doctors, because you need human empathy for that. Not oddly people like plumbers and electricians, because you need to be able to think on your feet in these environments that are always changing, but people who do mundane work are rapidly, and the idea is that they will be replaced and they're free to do other things, but perhaps there isn't anything for them to do because AI has taken all the jobs. And unfortunately, that is also being unregulated. So if we allow AI to develop the way we allow social media to develop, we're in real trouble. And this is all part of the ethos of surveillance capitalism. This is Shoshana Zuboff's idea. It's advanced capitalism, which is leading to a concentration of wealth and power, because not only do they have the money, but they have all the data that gives them the money. And I mean, a few hundred people in America are as rich as 50% of the rest of the population, the poorest people on the planet. And surveillance capitalism is leading to elemental brutalities. You see that with exclusionary practices, people losing their jobs, people losing their lands, making way for mining in the Amazon and in Alaska or wherever. And these are the sort of brutalities you associate with older, less developed, less sophisticated political systems. We've kind of returned to this kind of medieval pattern where there's a small elite who are basically tax-free and free to do what they like, and then the middle classes are squeezed and pay for everything, and then there's an increasingly large underclass that is disenfranchised, but almost slaves to this. And this relates to another idea of Foucault, which was biopower. He said, without biopower, the Industrial Revolution wouldn't have happened. We work, say, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. So that goes into this apparatus of capitalist production. But with surveillance capitalism and social media, we're online all the time, or we're being monitored all the time, because we don't mind it, because we get the convenience of looking up things or buying things or being amused or whatever. Sadly, we've inserted ourselves into this biopower apparatus, and it's our actions that provide the data that these companies actually harvest. However, there is hope. We do end on a note of hope, because it is possible to have agency, provided, as we've seen, with these people who, and this is something that cropped up, struggle, grassroots, bottom up, people clubbing together as humans concerned about things can come together and make a difference, and we need to. So we have to make sure that we don't allow our rights to disappear, especially if it's just for entertainment. And one last final thing was, Postman mentioned 2 dystopian books, 1984 by Orwell, and Brave New World, which was about 15 years earlier by Huxley. And in 1984, they're busy trying to ban books because they have knowledge. We live in a more Huxleyan dystopia because they don't need to ban the books because nobody reads them because they're so busy being entertained. So we are literally entertaining ourselves to death, sadly. Anyway, that was the epilogue. Thank you very much.